There's something about Leo Tolstoy that's both intimidating and strangely intimate. We know him as one of the greatest novelists in history, War and Peace, Anna Karenina. Those enormous, almost mythic texts that seem to capture the whole of human experience. Images of Tolstoy stare back at us from old photos and paintings. That iconic beard, that fixed but slightly wild gaze. He takes on the quality of a deity looking down from the mount. The world has its way of creating these characters. They're unmistakable yet remain distant and somewhat mystical. But there is a less assured Tolstoy, one who isn't satisfied with his own achievement, who questions the foundation of the life he's built. This is the Tolstoy that wrote Confession, who looked at the spoils of success, the acclaim of the world, and found emptiness. This short biographical work, written in 1882, is Tolstoy briefly stepping from behind the veil of his greatness and presenting us with a rare gift, his very human fragility. The old sage of literary myth becomes a doubtful, vulnerable person, just like the rest of us. In the early parts of Confession, Tolstoy talks about how he drifted from his religious upbringing, how spirituality started to seem less important, even laughable at times. He went through what many young people experience as they step into adulthood, a desire to reject the old ways, to feel superior to the previous generation. It's almost like a rite of passage to throw off the constraints of the past and embrace what feels new and more enlightened. In his youth, Tolstoy, an egoist, was all about self-improvement, saying his only real belief back then was a faith in self-perfection. He doesn't hold back when reflecting on his reckless and indulgent younger days. I killed people in war. I challenged people to duels in order to kill them. I lost at cards. I consumed the labour of peasants. I punished them. I fornicated. I deceived. Lies, theft, adultery of every kind, drunkenness, violence, murder. There was no crime I did not commit, and for all this my contemporaries praised me and thought me a relatively moral man, as they still do. These were the recollections of a man now in later life who finds himself spiralling into a spiritual crisis. It's not just some passing phase or philosophical thought experiment. It was deeply visceral, existential, and almost led Tolstoy to end his own life. He was a man who, by all worldly standards, had everything, yet he'd reached a point where none of it mattered. Is there any meaning in my life which the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy? He wrote. A question that would spiral into months of torment as he looked at everything he had accomplished and saw it swallowed by the void. Tolstoy's crisis is relatable. Yes, he was successful and wealthy, and many of us will never know such privilege, but he was experiencing something most of us encounter at some point, no matter our status. The realization that the things we chase, the things we think will give our lives meaning, don't actually satisfy us. It's like he spent his whole life climbing a mountain, and when he got to the top, the view was nothing but fog. He had breathed life into it, and it followed him, cloaking him from feelings that might infiltrate his inner turmoil. It worked until it no longer did. Tolstoy writes about the moment this fog lifted with terrifying clarity. My question was the simplest of questions, lying in the soul of every man. What will come of what I am doing today or shall do tomorrow? This question becomes a haunting refrain. Tolstoy is looking at his own life as if he's outside of it, detached, almost cold. And the answers he finds are quite devastating. Nothing. No amount of wealth, no number of masterpieces written can save him from the inescapable reality of death, and this thought leads him to a place of despair. This is a very human experience. We are all living on a rock, floating through a darkness that seems unfathomable, a space that is too large to begin to contemplate. We are surrounded by the infinite, but we know from a young age that our personal time here is finite. The why is a question that no one has managed to answer sufficiently, though many have tried. The catch being, if we dwell there for too long, the shadow might consume us, and the only life we convince ourselves we have could fade into endless grey. And so we seek distraction and reassurance in earthly things. We surround ourselves with noise or retreat to a quiet corner. The cycle continues. We collect possessions. We attempt to construct a force field of protection from the infinite because it's simply too much to think about. Every day we are followed by the footfalls of our own expiration. In our youth, they are soft, almost imperceptible. But as the summers pass, we begin to recognize the sound as it draws closer. It arrives uninvited at night. Sometimes it comes right up close, and we can almost sense the breathing of some invisible body standing over our bed, counting down the days. It's enough to pull anyone down into paralysis. Tolstoy is forced to meet this condition with energy. There's something about his spiritual crisis that isn't just about despair. It's about a longing for something real, something enduring. He knows deep down that there must be more to life than the superficial trappings of success. Something strange began to happen to me, he writes. I had a wife whom I loved and who loved me. I had a large estate which, without much effort on my part, increased. I had fame and respect, but I could not live because I could not see any meaning in life. Tolstoy's crisis, in a way, was one of modernity. He was experiencing what so many of us experience today. It's the moment you look at your life and understand that the game you've been playing, the rules you've been following, are broken, and the only way out is to turn away. For many of us, however, it feels like we are trapped. How can we break out from this web that sustains us on so many basic levels, as well as selling us a dream that we know deep down is empty and for many unattainable? We are trapped in a sense, and the biting jaws of this trap are kept primed by our fears. This reality is constructed so tightly we believe that if we step away we will perish, we will become like those we see on the street who have fallen from society, the man digging through the rubbish, the mad-eyed drunk woman shouting at passers-by. And once you go over that wall, it's hard to get back in. The kingdom we have constructed is built that way to keep us here, obedient, forever trying not to mess things up. Otherwise, we tell ourselves, everything good will spiral away from us at a blinding pace. When we do not have wealth, it's easy to believe that it must be the silver bullet to all our problems. If we no longer have to worry about money, then surely we will be free and happy, but there's too much evidence to challenge this notion. Tolstoy's crisis is documented proof, as good as any. He was born into money, the son of a nobleman, Count Nikolai Tolstoy. He, his three brothers and sister were brought up by their aunts in a golden age on the family estate, Yasnaya Polyana, with its thousands of acres and hundreds of serfs which Tolstoy inherited and lived with his own family throughout his years of fame and success. This charmed life and worldwide recognition and praise did not save Tolstoy from the reckonings of his existence. He turned to science with all its methods and rules of describing reality. When he asked, "What is the meaning of life?" science fell short, giving him the makeup of the universe, the origin of species, and answering, "You are what you call your life. You are a transitory, casual cohesion of particles." To some, this is fascinating. But Tolstoy found mostly circular reasoning in these kinds of explanations, the answer diverting at the crucial moment, leaving the question still begging. To end life, then, seemed to him the only logical answer. Life was a cruel joke. He believed that he knew this explicitly, but when he looked around him, he saw people just floating along, unaware or just unbothered. Tolstoy saw 4 different mindsets that allowed for this. Ignorance, a lack of knowledge or wisdom, a sort of perpetual childlike state of unquestioning. There was nothing to learn from this. Epicureanism, the eat, drink and be merry state of being, offered that the best way to deal with the condition of being alive and knowing that it is, in essence, meaningless is to enjoy the pleasures we have to the utmost, ignoring the oncoming end until it comes. Many of Tolstoy's contemporaries and acquaintances existed just like this. Strength and energy, the ending of life. This state accepted fully the meaninglessness of life and embraces this by taking action and putting an end to it by their own hand. He wrote, "Having understood the stupidity of the joke that has been played on them, and having understood that it is better to be dead than to be alive, and it's best of all not to exist." For Tolstoy, this action seemed the most logical and the bravest, but it was relatively uncommon. The 4th state was weakness, a cowardly person that is fully aware of the emptiness of existence but chooses to wait for something, though they have no idea what that something might be. This is where Tolstoy saw himself. He did not have the strength or bravery to end his life and found himself just muddling on, caught in a loop of endless ponderance and inaction. Something had to give. The great Russian writer found himself in a bind. His mind was too engaged and questioning to slide back into apathy. It's almost as if he had to die to his old self in order to be reborn. He writes, "I understand that what I had called up to then my beliefs were not beliefs at all. I understood that I could not find the meaning of life in rational knowledge." He comes to realize that he and the people he is surrounded by are just a sheltered, minuscule sect. They are the educated, rich, the self-appointed gatekeepers of knowledge who looked on the everyday people, the workers, the peasants, as some kind of human cattle. He and his contemporaries had long lived this lunacy, a detached state that elevated them as the only ones who really searched for meaning. A light bulb went off as he saw what those outside his circles actually possessed. Something that he and none of his socialite friends were connected to. Faith. In order to live and understand the meaning of life, he must seek this meaning not among those who have lost it, but with those who make life and who support the burden of their own lives and of ours also. It may seem predictable and almost cliched that Tolstoy chose to revisit a belief in a higher power. But it was not a readoption of the formal, institutionalized Christianity he had once known. It was a more personal and mystical faith that combined Christian ethics with his own philosophical inquiries. He came to believe in a God that could be understood through the heart and conscience rather than through church rituals or doctrines. He set about radically changing the way he lived, believing that a true Christian life necessitated simplicity, humility, and self-denial, a life aligned with those who had served him up to now, the serfs, the peasants. He rejected his aristocratic privileges and the luxuries of his estate. He adopted a life of manual labor, often dressing in peasant clothing, working in the fields and simplifying his diet. He became a vegetarian, believing it was morally wrong to kill animals for food. These newfound beliefs led him to renounce his previous materialism. He distanced himself from his wealth, refusing royalties for his literary works and rejecting intellectual property. This was an extremely controversial decision within his family, particularly for his wife, Sonia, who struggled greatly with the financial implications of his choices. Tolstoy followed confession with "The kingdom of God is within you," a more focused and seeking text that laid out his vision of a true spiritual way of being. God, or faith in God, was contained in the individual. It did not need the counsel of men of the cloth to be fully realized. All that was just a power play, a tool of control, un-Christ-like. He emphasized the teachings of Jesus, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, which he saw as advocating for non-violence, love, and forgiveness. This marked the beginning of his alignment with Christian anarchism and pacifism. His interpretation of Jesus' teachings focused heavily on the idea of turning the other cheek and rejecting all forms of violence, including war, self-defense, and the state's use of force. He turned away from writing fiction and began focusing on religious and philosophical essays. The Kingdom of God is Within You outlines his idea on Christian pacifism and anarchism. His work now fully emphasized personal conscience over institutional authority. He became a vocal critic of the Russian Orthodox Church, which he saw as corrupt, hypocritical, and complicit in the oppression of the poor. In his view, the Church had strayed far from the true teachings of Christ, aligning itself with the Russian government and its imperial interests. As a Christian anarchist, there was only one true source of authority, that of God as embodied in the teachings of Jesus. Christian anarchists characterized state power as the work of the devil, citing Jesus' rebuking of Satan in the desert as a message to the anarchist that to be truly aligned with God, man must reject all temptations of earthly power. Tolstoy's fiery critique culminated in his excommunication by the Church in 1901. He also condemned the Russian state, particularly its military and legal systems, which he believed perpetuated violence, oppression, and inequality. The great Russian writer literally unraveled his life as a way to try and put himself back together. He was done with clinging to something he no longer valued. Some might suggest this was yet another act of an egoist. What about his family, his responsibilities? Why did he feel the need to document his transformations? Was there still a part of him that craved recognition? Was he just setting another trap for himself, swinging wildly from one extreme to the next? Many people live these quiet, humble lives and dedicate themselves to spirituality unseen, not celebrated. But in many ways, Tolstoy had little choice. His stature was so great, it was nearly inevitable that his crisis would flow out into the world and be scrutinized by the public and the many institutions he was critical of. It was 1909, and far away in South Africa, a young lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi had been struggling with his own questions about violence, oppression, and the truth. Gandhi, who had already begun to develop his philosophy of resistance through non-violence, was searching for a way to express the deep moral convictions stirring inside him. It was then he came across "The Kingdom of God is Within You." It resonated with him as if Tolstoy had been speaking directly to him. By this time, Tolstoy's body was frail. but his ideas burned with a clarity only age and suffering can bring. He argued that true power lay not in violence or force, but in moral integrity, in the refusal to meet evil with evil. His ideas were, in many ways, a mirror to the principle Gandhi had drawn from the Bhagavad Gita, from Jainism, and from his own heart. Tolstoy's words felt like an echo of Gandhi's unspoken thoughts, and so Gandhi reached out, writing to Tolstoy in 1909. He attached a copy of Indian Home Rule, his own treatise on self-reliance and resistance. Their correspondence, though brief and separated by thousands of miles, was filled with a quiet intensity. The most famous of these letters, sent by Tolstoy on September 7, 1910, is often referred to as a letter to a Hindu. In it, Tolstoy spoke with the voice of a man who had already seen too much suffering, too much destruction. He urged Gandhi, and by extension the people of India, to resist the British Empire not with violence, but with love. The sole means of leading men towards the truth is non-resistance to evil, Tolstoy wrote. What is necessary, therefore, is not that we should follow any particular scheme of politics or have recourse to violence in any shape or form, but that we should take no part in violence, however it may be concealed. There's something achingly vulnerable in these words. Tolstoy, by then a man approaching his end, seemed to be pouring out the wisdom of a lifetime of struggle, regret, and revelation. He had come to believe that violence, even the violence we justify as necessary, only perpetuates more suffering. He had seen the cycles of hatred and power, and all that was left to him was love, unarmed and unyielding. Gandhi wrote back with reverence. Here was a kindred spirit, someone who shared his belief in the moral power of non-violence, someone who understood the weight of spiritual resistance. His letters were full of gratitude, recognizing Tolstoy's ideas as a reflection of the truth he had long sought to define within himself. In Tolstoy's words, he found the reassurance that his path was not only righteous, but universal. Amidst this correspondence, Tolstoy had become more and more disillusioned with his own situation. His home life was in disarray. Journalists had been visiting his estate for years, looking for a story on the great novelist turned religious anarchist. He was now a spectacle once more, but for much different reasons. His publicized transformation attracted the attention of a circus of followers. Pilgrims seeking a leader, lost souls who wandered onto the grounds of Polyana to be close to the energies of the mystic figure Tolstoy had become. Diary entries from his wife Sonia detailed the arrival of the Dark Ones. The Tolstoyans were born, a tribe of disciples that clung to the words of their new master in a cultish fervour. Tolstoy once again found himself in a bind. Though he felt responsibility for his family's well-being, ultimately he viewed this lifestyle of privilege as morally wrong. Maintaining it meant that he could not fully embrace the life he craved, one of pure and total spiritual submission. His following continued to grow, and those among it questioned why Tolstoy was not practicing fully what he had been preaching. They lived in communes, while their leader was still the head of a great estate with serfs and acres of land. It did not compute. Tolstoy attempted to solve this dilemma by signing over all of his possessions, Polyana included, to his wife and children, as if he was already dead. He and Sonia began to fight constantly, long into the night. Their shouting and sobbing would make the walls shake. Tolstoy would bellow that he was fleeing to America. His wife would run screaming into the garden, threatening suicide. A power struggle between Sonia and one of the more prominent of Tolstoy's cult followers, a man known as Chertkov, saw him caught in the middle of a storm. Chertkov had grown so close to Tolstoy that Sonia was threatening to murder the man by poisoning if her husband did not cut their ties. Reportedly, on a tree stump in the woods surrounding the estate, Tolstoy had signed a secret will in which he left all his copyrights in the control of Chertkov and of his own youngest daughter, Sasha, a fervent Tolstoyan. This had long been Sonia's worst fear. It became an unbearable situation, and after much deliberation, Tolstoy decided the only solution was to leave the estate, to abandon his wife and family. It was around 3 in the morning on October 28 when Tolstoy woke up to the sound of Sonia rummaging through his desk drawers. His heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the last straw. Before the sun even had a chance to rise, he grabbed an electric flashlight and quietly left Yasnaya Polyana, leaving behind everything. His doctor, Makovitsky, who was a devout Tolstoyan, followed him into the night. The journey was grueling. 26 hours later, they arrived in Shamardino, where his sister Maria lived as a nun. Tolstoy thought he could settle there in a little rented hut, maybe live out the rest of his days in quiet. But that wasn't meant to be. The very next day, Sasha, one of his daughters, found him. Together with Makovitsky, she convinced him that running away to the Caucasus was the better idea. And so, on October 31st, they boarded a second-class train. They bought their tickets one station at a time, always trying to stay a step ahead. Tolstoy was already very ill. The fever grew worse as they travelled. He was shaking uncontrollably, shivering with chills. By the time they reached Astapovo, he couldn't go any further. They had to stop. The station master's house became an impromptu sick room, and Tolstoy's body began to give in. Fever, delirium, convulsions. He lost consciousness. The pain in his head was sharp and constant. The ringing in his ears unbearable. He couldn't breathe. He hiccuped, his pulse racing, his thirst unquenchable. His tongue swelled. He forgot where he was, who he was. Every so often, in a burst of lucidity, he'd say that he'd written something new, he wanted to dictate it. But when the moment came, he'd either fall silent or start mumbling, words jumbled and incomprehensible. "Read to me what I've said," he'd ask Sasha. "What did I write?" One time, frustration took over and he tried to wrestle with her, shouting, "Let me go, how dare you hold me, let me go." Dr. Makovitsky called it catarrhal pneumonia. On November 2nd, Sonia arrived. She wasn't allowed to see him though. She stayed in a train car nearby, just waiting. If he recovered and tried to escape again, she had a plan. She'd pay 5,000 rubles for a detective to follow him wherever he went. But Tolstoy didn't recover. His breathing became laboured, each breath wheezing and strained. He couldn't remember how to use his pocket watch. Then, on November 6th, for a brief, fleeting moment, he regained some clarity. He looked at his daughters and told them, "Remember, there are many people in the world besides Lev Tolstoy." And the next day, on November 7th, he died. After his passing, theories circulated about the great writer's demise. Had he been poisoned by one of his followers, his doctor, Chertkov, agents of the government? Suspicions were even directed towards his wife, but none came to any provable conclusions. It was a sad day for Russia. They had lost a giant voice, one that reached out across the world. First as the creator of the great Russian novel, his writing held up as the pinnacle of literary achievement. Second, as a man who publicly turned his back on all this glory and merit to wrestle with the central question of human existence. Why does it matter? What does a life that is finite mean, if anything? How to confront a world steeped in cruelty without becoming cruel. Tolstoy and those he influenced sought an answer in love. Not the easy love of affection, but the demanding sacrificial love that asks us to suffer for the sake of others. Tolstoy's words became more than just philosophy. They became a lifeline, a way to cling to hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. One man's crisis and rejection of dogma and doctrine became a sort of gospel of its own. He believed that true revolution begins not in the halls of power, but in the hearts of individuals. Everyone thinks of changing the world, he famously said, but no one thinks of changing himself.